presentation. In the meantime, we would like to hear where everyone is joining us from. Please note your location in the chat feature. And please join us for the next Wheaton Conversations with Losang Samten on Thursday, October 1st at 6 p.m. Eastern Time. Losang Samten is a Tibetan master artist who will discuss the ancient and sacred art form of the Wheel of Life mandala. Marcy will put the link in the chat to learn more and register. This evening, we are joined by artists Wendel and Glynnis. We will be chatting with them momentarily. Before we get started, we would like to make sure that you have a comfortable viewing experience. To that end, it is my pleasure to introduce Marcy Peterson, who will be handling all of our technical needs throughout the program. Marcy has been with WheatonArts since 1994. She is the IT director, and her undergraduate and graduate studies were in fine art, e-business, marketing, and public relations. Marcy, can you provide us with some tech tips for this webinar?
I certainly can, Sarah. Thank you so much. And thank you both to Wendel and Glynnis for being here today. And this is going to be really interesting and in-depth presentation. I'm so excited about it. I want to start by letting you all know that this is a webinar, and that's a little bit different than a Zoom meeting. And by opening the Q&A window, you will be able to ask questions, type your questions in there, and Sarah, the host, will then be able to manage those questions, let you know if some of them are going to be answered live or have been answered live, and then present them to the speakers as they go along and at the very end. So don't worry if we're not answering it, if we don't get to it right at the moment that you're asking it. There will be a Q&A at the close or near the close of the session. As an attendee, you can also like other attendees' questions. You simply click that thumbs up button next to the question. And in the chat box, as Sarah mentioned, where we'd like to hear from where you're from, you can also follow along for links for additional resources and text between attendees should you like know where they are from or know someone or would like another comment that they've talked about. Remember to keep your questions in the Q&A window because this is where Sarah's going to be looking for them. We won't be using the raise your hand feature. We'll simply use the Q&A and the chat feature. Should you lose connection for any reason, I want to assure you that you can simply close all your windows, go back to your original email link and join again. You can come and go as you need to. If you have to step away, you can simply step away, or you can close out and come back. This session is being recorded, as you may have noticed, and as this is a webinar, only the host and the panelists will be heard and recorded. And you are not going to be heard over the speaker. If you need to customize your experience here in Zoom, there is a small green icon up to the upper left of your screen. And if you click on that, you'll see a lot of things to customize. For this instance, I believe the only thing you may want to customize is making the chat font a little bit larger. By doing that, you click on that green icon, click on accessibility, and you'll see the adjustment at that time. Just a few things about WheatonArts. We are celebrating our 50th anniversary this year, and we also appreciate your support. So if you enjoy this free webinar, please feel free to contact Rhody Barron, Director of Development at WheatonArts, and her information is on the screen, and I'll also put that in the chat. But also know that you can also become a member or donate to support WheatonArts. And of course, my favorite is shopping at WheatonArts, and you support the artist when you, as well as WheatonArts, when you shop at WheatonArts. And it's very easy to remember our website. It'll take you right to the shopping cart if you type in shop.wheatonarts.org. Not that I'm going to go over all these wonderful benefits of membership, but I will let you know that members get it all and remind you that gift memberships are always available. So while you're buying your membership, you can also purchase one for a friend. I'm going to throw it back to Sarah Lacey now. But before I do, I'm going to tell you a little bit about her. Sarah Lacey is a special events coordinator at WheatonArts. She recently began this role in February 2020. So she's a new face around campus. And now that we're open again, you'll be able to see her around campus. Sarah has worked as an event coordinator and sales manager previously at Willow Creek Winery in Cape May and for the Noyes Museum of Art in Oceanville, New Jersey. She's excited to combine her love of art with her background in event planning at WheatonArts. She received her Bachelor in Fine Arts with a concentration on printmaking from Stockton University. So I'll hand it over to you for the program now, Sarah.
Thank you for that introduction, Marcy. Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us with this program, during which we'll be hearing from artists Wendel White and Glynnis Reed. And Wendel White was born in Newark, New Jersey, and grew up in New York, Pennsylvania, and New Jersey. He was awarded a BFA in photography from the School of Visual Arts in New York and an MFA in photography from the University of Texas at Austin. White taught photography at the School of Visual Arts, New York, the Cooper Union for the Advancement of Science and Art, New York, the International Center for Photography, New York, Rochester Institute of Technology, and is currently Distinguished Professor of Art and American Studies at Stockton University. He has received various awards and fellowships, including a John Simon Guggenheim Foundation Fellowship in Photography, 3 Artist Fellowships from the New Jersey State Council for the Arts, Fun Lectureship in Photography, Anne Reeves Artists in Residence for the Arts Council of Princeton, and grants from the Center of Santa Fe, Juror's Choice, the Graham Foundation for Advanced Studies in the Fine Arts, and the New Works Photography Fellowship from NFOGO. And Glynnis Reed, for well over a decade, Glynnis Reed has worked as a professional visual artist, writer, and scholar. Born in Los Angeles, California, she currently lives and works in Southern New Jersey. In her artistic practice, Miss Reed explores identity and place and the complexities of one's relationship with the self and others. Her art engages narratives of love and loss, fulfillment and emptiness, shadow and light. She works in photography, mixed media, collage, painting, poetry, and creative nonfiction in a diverse, innovative methodology that reflects her conceptual approach to communicating her ideas. Miss Reed will begin her doctoral studies in art education and women's gender and sexuality studies at Pennsylvania State University in spring 2021. Glynnis Reed graduated with an MFA in studio art from the University of California, Irvine. She has exhibited her work extensively at the local, national, and international levels. So thanks, guys, for coming on today. And we'll hand everything over to Glynnis at this point.
Okay. Thank you so much, Sarah. So I'm so thankful to Sarah Lacey and to Marcy Peterson, and of course my colleague Wendel White. And I'm just pulling up my screen here.
You have a tab at the very top that has the Google slide over the top on the right.
Okay, thank you.
That's why
that was too easy, right? Thank you. So yes, I'm Glynnis Reed, and I'm so happy to be joining you here today. And it's my honor to be here with Wendel White, who invited me to be in conversation with you all today. And to start off, I'd like to say that I'm a lifelong artist, writer, and poet, in addition to my work as an educator. And I attended an arts high school in Los Angeles where I took one of my first creative writing classes. I first discovered Walt Whitman as a student at Arts High, and this poem has stayed with me for years as one of my all-time favorites. And it goes, "As I lay with my head in your lap, camarado. As I lay with my head in your lap, camarado, the confession I made I resume. What I said to you in the open air I resume. I know I am restless and make others so. I know my words are weapons full of danger, full of death, for I confront peace, security, and all the settled laws to unsettle them. I am more resolute because all have denied me than I could ever have been had all accepted me. I heed not and have never heeded either experience, cautions, majorities, or ridicule. And the threat of what is called hell is little or nothing to me. And the lure of what is called heaven is little or nothing to me. Dear camarado, I confess I have urged you onward with me and still urge you without the least idea what is our destination, or whether we shall be victorious or utterly quelled and defeated." So this poem really means a lot to me because it kind of speaks to my soul, and it's something that stuck with me for many, many years. And I think it reflects the attitude that I take towards my art and my art making and the stories that I try to tell in my own art. Also, Audre Lorde has been an inspiration for me over the years. I became aware of the work of Audre Lorde, who was a self-professed Black lesbian feminist mother warrior poet. Her life and work fascinated me as a young undergrad, and I carried her book, Sister Outsider, with me to classes when I was a student studying abroad in Zimbabwe. This excerpt from her poem, Litany for Survival, has been a lifelong inspiration to me as well, and I wanted to share that with you as well today. And when we speak, we are afraid our words will not be heard nor welcomed. But when we are silent, we are still afraid. So it is better to speak, remembering we were never meant to survive. I've always found this poem so powerful, to be so powerful. And sometimes I've struggled to have my voice and to be able to speak my voice. And Audre Lorde has always been an inspiration in that way, to not be afraid, to push even when you are afraid. Wendell and I wanted to also include some discussion of Breonna Taylor during this talk. So for me, Amy Sherrill's portrait of Breonna Taylor on Vanity Fair is just beautiful. And during this talk, it's my hope that some of the themes I covered will bring light to the value of Black women's lives. The body of work that I will share covers 20 years of creating, and I would like to emphasize the importance of highlighting Black women's beauty, power, and spirituality at the same time that I explore the relationship between identity and place, particularly in nature and the city. So the first body of work that I'll be speaking about is the Zimbabwe Series. I studied abroad in Zimbabwe for 6 months in 1998 and 1999 as a senior in undergrad. And this particular image shows my passport along with an image of me that was taken while I was a student there. This image, Speaking Eyes, is really personal to me because it's the first Photoshop image I ever created. And I started working with Photoshop back in 2000. And the landscape that it shows is, they call it Kamusha in Shona, but it's the homeland for people that they always go back to. And there's an image of a friend that I made there, along with my visa that I had. And so the image of landscape and Black women has been something persistent in my work for a very long time. This particular image is one of my first multi-layered images as well, and it shows a silhouette motif that's reoccurred frequently in my later work. This is an image called Promise that's been very popular. A lot of people really love this image, but it once again shows Kamusha, and you can see the imbas, or the round huts that have kind of thatched pointed roofs next to the grandfather's house, who has a more traditional Western looking house, but there were imbas all over this property of this family that I stayed with as a student. And I had just such an amazing time studying there. Urban Sites. Urban Sites is a series I created in 2002 to 2003 for my thesis work in grad school. And I was based in Los Angeles. I lived in Los Angeles, and I wanted to show South LA. So it was really important to me to show the texture of the environment, the places without showing people, to show these buildings that had hand-painted signage, and to convey something about the community through this language that was painted on the surface of these buildings, as well as these vernacular images. So that was something that was really fascinating to me at that time, to tell a story about the place that I was from. I grew up in South LA and lived there for most of my life until I transplanted to the East Coast 10 years ago. And I think this particular piece really speaks to some of the tensions that we have in Black and Brown communities in Los Angeles. Even though a lot of times we occupy the same places and the same spaces, there was difficulty making bridges in a way that this photograph captures. Cityscapes shows sort of the archive of city imagery that I was capturing at the time. And you can see many different places I traveled to, including my parents' house at the very bottom, their house that they moved into when they relocated to the East Coast. But I travel a lot, and I really enjoy being in different environments, and it really grows me to be able to learn from other people and other places. So I enjoy doing residencies and just having a chance to be out and about and take photos wherever I go. I also captured graffiti for this series and started working with drawing with the Wacom tablet and using the pen tool to make digital drawings that I layered into my digital collages. And so this is a diptych of my partner at the time and his son and his son's girlfriend, who was expecting. And I wanted to tell a story about love in this particular series. I did a portrait, self-portrait for this particular work as well. And this piece was sort of like a bridge piece for me into Elements of Love, which was a really kind of well-known series for me that's coming up next in the slideshow. But in this particular piece, you can see the insurgence of natural landscape along with the city imagery, and along with the drawings of myself and my partner that I had done at the time, the partner that I had at the time. So this work is from about 2004, 2005. And Elements of Love. Elements of Love is a series I created that was based on using silhouetted imagery to represent a presence and absence, simultaneous presence and absence, along with the distance and tensions in this particular love relationship. And so the city and the environment and nature become a stage for this particular story unfolding. This was also a time where my skills as an artist with Photoshop was really becoming so much more refined, and I was gaining a lot of attention for this particular body of work that I had created in Los Angeles. This is one of my favorite, called Destiny. And it's amazing how you can really do so much with digital imagery to combine different aesthetics with drawing and photo-based imagery and even painted elements. And painterly aspects are really important to me in my work with photography. And this particular park is called Kenneth Hahn Park. And it's a really well-known park in Los Angeles, which was really close to where I lived at the time. And that collision of the urban and the concrete to the nature was really interesting juxtaposition that I thought really spoke to me in this particular body of work. And this is called A Long Way From Here. And you can see that distance that's grown between the two subjects in this series, as well as the landscape, the dry landscape that kind of echoes the thorniness between the two people. Djerassi Explorations, this was an opportunity I had to do a residency in the Redwoods in Northern California in 2009. And so my explorations of the landscape and nature got a chance to really grow and expand at the time that I did this series, and at the time that I traveled up north. It was really an amazing experience. I had the opportunity to have two models. One woman who is in this image, whose silhouette is in this image, was a dancer, and she also knew sign language. So she was able to bring so much more dynamism to the poses of my silhouettes that I was doing at the time. While also at the same time, I was interested in women's presence and the power of women and women in nature, and what kind of relationship or connection I could make between the female body and nature. Obscura is a series that, it was a series of 20 images that sort of was the culminating work from my residency. I completed a lot of the compositions while I was there at Djerassi, but I also refined and completed and really worked with layering the images and creating these compositions that were really have a painterly element due to the layering of the landscapes. I took photos, close-up photos of the earth when I was in the woods, taking hikes and taking photos, and created these images when I would come back to the studio, and layered in kind of dark shading, layers of dark shading to create a mysterious mood. And so there's a feeling that there's a sense of regeneration and death, and again, connection of women's bodies to nature and the earth that I've achieved in this series. Paper Thin Boundaries. Now, Paper Thin Boundaries is a series of self-portraits that I created from another residency that I did in Austria. So in 2011, I had the opportunity to travel to Austria and attend Air Krems, which was located in the wine country of Austria in a beautiful landscaped area, not too far from Vienna. But this poem that I wrote later kind of captures the feeling and the tone and the mood of what that series represents for me. And I'll read that now. This poem that I wrote is called A.K. Wolf Woman. He found her repugnant, could not stand her hairy ways, nor her desire that laid like a limp pat of butter on a clean plate. He hunted her to the margins of his brain, knew she was wolf woman, brazen plunges beneath woman. In a black nest he wallowed with prayers in the hollow of hope buried under her dreams. So I really got into the richness of the layers of landscape imagery, along with posing for myself and capturing graffiti images for this series. And I was blessed to have an one-person exhibition in Austria while I was doing the residency there. And this piece is called Obliteration. And I really love how this constructed environment of all these layered images that create the space, this landscape area, this natural environment, layered with this painterly quality of the graffiti, two different layers of graffiti imagery overlaid over my figure, kind of create this really atmospheric quality in this composition. And this piece is called No One Else, and you can see the graffiti is an element, a character in the composition as well, floating in this kind of mysterious way. And then the graffiti that I captured, there was so many different types of graffiti, from spray painted graffiti to kind of sgraffito, like scratchings on trees or on walls. I think people painting or writing with ink pens on the walls and different places that I would find. It was pretty amazing being able to capture all the different things that I captured in my photography while I was abroad. So the elements of tagging too has always been really interesting to me, as a mark making, as well as a way that people can articulate who they are and try to find their voice and claim their voice at times in life when maybe you have a hard time claiming your voice. And that's sort of where I was at the time. But art has always been a way for me to express myself in a way that's been powerful for me. From the earth to the skies. This series is composed of all imagery that I photographed in Austria. From a monastery that I photographed the ceiling fresco and the landscape and nature and graffiti. I captured all the imagery for this series in Austria, but I created the compositions after I came home and completed this series in 2013. So this has also been a very popular series for me, and I've had a lot of success with this. But there's like kind of a moodiness and quality of like dreaminess and spirituality to this that I really love. And the layering and kind of graphic quality to it is something that seems to really speak to people. This particular image is called Getting to Know the World. And I love how I was able to have the graffiti imagery kind of become interwoven with the landscape and become embedded with it and kind of grow out of it, while also sort of referencing the idea of the tree of knowledge of good and evil. And I also captured images in some of the museums that I attended while I was in Vienna. This is from the Museum of Natural History, and from a display of kind of primordial beings that I wanted to have suspended in this space that's sort of mystical. And in this particular image, you see the display of butterflies that was in the display at the Natural History Museum, along with the landscape. And if you look really carefully, you can see that over an overlay in the background, there's multiple columns, sort of like Greco-Roman columns that are kind of in a yellow light that's overlaid in the background. So there's this painterly element to the combination of images that's really important to me and has consistently been important to me in my aesthetic over the years. And this is called Night and Day, with the lighter colored moths in the background in contrast to the butterflies and the graffiti and landscape. And this is called Saints and Sinners. So they have these wonderful kind of monuments in the center of walking squares in Krems, where you could see these kind of religious monuments. And it was really an amazing thing to try to create a contrast between the graffiti and this spiritual dimension. This next exploration is Cosmos Ecology, and this is a work in progress, but I'm really interested in how this can express parallels between nature and a really kind of densely layered, ornate collaging of nature elements that echoes the cosmos, or the idea of what's universal or beyond our earthly plane. And the model here is my niece, Melissa, who's been a model for a lot of different pieces I've created over the years, but she's almost like a alter ego for me in my artwork. But I like the idea of representing twinness in a lot of my artworks, and you'll see there's a lot of work that's not on this, that I haven't shared in this presentation, but there's a lot of work that I do that includes mirroring or showing doubling of a figure, of the same figure. And so it's sort of like that relationship that we have to the self and to our conversations that we have with ourselves. And so that's important to me as well. And this piece is called the Assumption, and kind of echoing religious artworks, religious sculptures that show figures that are kind of being drawn up to God. And in this case, she's being pulled up also by nature. Ascending Beauty is a series that I created that was about the people who were the Black women in my life who were really important to me, who I admired, who I loved. And I wanted to show their spirituality, power, and beauty by representing halos and auras around their images. In a lot of the images, I have this kind of densely layered aesthetic with the natural imagery. And the women are really powerful, and you can feel that in these images. And it's important to me, this is a self-portrait, it's important to me to convey the power of Black women. This is my grandmother in my work, you know, echoing back to Breonna Taylor, the need to recognize that Black women have importance in this society and are vital, and our lives need to be respected and loved. So it's something that I do naturally in my own art, and I'm thankful that I have the opportunity to show that love to friends of mine and family members and loved ones through this series. And I've given many of my models for this particular series copies of this work so that they can enjoy it for themselves. And this is my niece Melissa again. She's just such a powerful model, just so emotional. Her power just really resonates and radiates from her. That Shadow My Likeness is another series that includes imagery of Melissa and my former partner's niece, Alexandria. And the poem that goes with this series is called That Shadow My Likeness by Walt Whitman. That shadow my likeness that goes to and fro, seeking a livelihood, chattering, chaffering. How often I find myself standing and looking at where it flits. How often I question and doubt whether that is really me. But among my lovers and caroling these songs, oh, I never doubt whether that is really me. And for me, when I made this work, I was really identifying with these young women. I wanted to represent the power and beauty of youth, of Black female youth, while at the same time wanting to convey the vulnerability there and mirroring the power of the Black female body to nature. And this is Alexandria, and the images that I photographed of her were in California prior to my move. And I created sort of like a filmic narrative through the different sequences of shots that I captured of the two different models. And with Alexandria in the California shots, you see the kind of dry landscape, the arid terrain of California, of Los Angeles. With Melissa, you see Birch Grove Park again, and the beautiful, lush green colors, and more, you can see that there's more water there, and it's a different terrain, a different climate. But it's there's some areas where I photographed where there's a parallel and overlap in the aesthetics of the scenes. In this particular image, I was interested in showing what happens when we're at the crossroads of decisions. And so this is called At the Threshold of Decision, and in a dialogue with the self and what how we reflect upon ourselves in different moods and emotions. And exploring the terrain. Palm trees are such an important motif for me in my work as well. And we'll see in the next series how I'm using palm trees with drawing. And it's interesting seeing in this particular series how Alexandria has a certain self-possession in the way that she holds herself and the way she's confident in her body, and you know, also representing beauty as an important aspect of this work as well. Beauty of nature as well as the beauty of the Black female models that I've used. The Beheld Beings is the last series that we're going to look at by me, and this is a series in which I took digital collages where I created photo-based images that were really kind of broken down in a lot of ways, very kind of abstract, and drew on top of them with India ink brush pens in black and white. And later on, we see some color in the drawings. But it was really important to me to show the kind of chaos of emotions and the darkness of moods that's possible to express through mark making and through the human form. So all the models here are female as well. And it's really just kind of going into a whole nother direction with the presence and the motif of Blackness, as well as the psyche. And this is called Vision of a New Self. And I really love how doing art and doing my work, I'm able to discover new things about myself and explore my own heart and to learn how to express myself and the things that may be hard to express. This is the first landscape that I created in this style and this technique called energy movement. And again, as I said, the palm tree and the palm leaves were important. And a lot of the drawings and previously seen in the previous slides have palm leaves that are kind of attached to the heads of the figures and growing out of the heads or in the background. And palm trees as a motif from being a Californian, a Southern Californian, also as a healing symbol, is also relevant in a lot of African traditional religions. So trying to capture that flow and energy through the line is really a challenge, but it's something so fun to do. And this is my last image, Shelter from the Rain. And I really love how I'm starting to use color with these drawings, with these India ink brush pen drawings. And in my current practice, my current body of work, I'm pushing my color palette into a lot more pastels and psychedelic colors. And so I'm having a lot of fun with growing in my drawing practice at this time. But thank you for joining me.
Thanks, Glynnis.
Thank you.
Now let's see how effective we can be at looking super professional. Not too bad, not too shabby. I've now I've taken over, and hopefully we'll get a chance to talk a bit about my approach with photography and with content, which is really quite different from Glynnis's, which is exactly why I was really interested in us having a conversation together. Because in fact, early on in my career photographically, I was invited into a panel with other African American artists in which everyone was really approaching content from a really dramatically different point of view. And it always stuck with me how important it was for African American artists, Black artists, diaspora artists, African diaspora artists, to be able to talk about the range of approaches that we have in our work, but yet how much those different visual strategies overlap in terms of the conversations and some of the things that are significant for us. I will at times go back and forth between talking informally about my work and then also just reading some prepared remarks, partly just to kind of keep myself focused so that I don't go on forever. And so let's start to take a look. The first project, and I'm going to go through a few different projects just in the same format that Glynnis has done, and is this project which was called Small Towns, Black Lives. And in going through this, one of the things I highlighted, and even though it's a mixture of things in here, is the degree to which some of my first encounters as I began photographing Black communities in southern New Jersey were with women in the community, Black women in the community that had held on to the history and the stories and the narratives of these communities. So I found it, really quite compelling that in thinking about our common interest in that concern and how much it coincided with the recent events and the outcomes of the Breonna Taylor um, grand jury indictments, it it reminded me that how critical the role that Black women were playing in many of these different communities, and how much somebody like Breonna Taylor would probably have continued to develop into someone that would have been really make significant contributions. She was already, making contributions in the way of helping people and, doing the work that she was doing. So these photographs are early images that I worked on in southern New Jersey, and different members of the community were really very helpful. Whitesboro was actually the first community that I photographed in Cape May County. And all of that actually came out of a conversation with a dear friend of mine who grew up in Philadelphia, but took summers visiting relatives in Whitesboro, New Jersey. And when I was coming to Stockton to teach at Stockton, she thought that this might be a community that I would be interested in, knowing a little bit about my work and what my interests were. So I started making trips to Whitesboro to meet and to encounter members of the community and photograph the members of the community. This was during one of the first community reunions that was held in Whitesboro in 1989. I think maybe it was the second, actually. I think the first one might have been 1988. But one of the things that was remarkable at this time is how much how informal these events were, and so it really was a wonderful opportunity for me to interact and connect with members of the community that really were tremendously generous in sharing their willingness to allow me to photograph and to record the community in various ways. Interestingly, by the time I finished this project, I don't actually spend all that much time photographing people for a period of time, and there's some elements of that I hope Glynnis and I will get to talk about, which is the degree to which landscape will play a role in both of our works, and the significance and the importance of landscape for Black life in the United States and globally. So one of the things that, and this is the second community that I began to photograph, which is no longer exists, and it's just a group of headstones, a small cemetery at the outer edge of Port Republic. And it was really the beginning of that becoming very involved in the landscape, and the notion that the landscape would contain the narrative that I was interested in. So one of the things that then opened up was the idea that I was interested in archival material, and I began connecting with archival material. This map at the time was hanging in the county office building out on Shore Road. Now the map has been moved to the county library in Mays Landing, but this map was drawn in 1872 by Beers Comstock and Klein. They were a New York map drawing company, but they're kind of the company concept was that they would approach various communities, townships, counties, etc., and offer to draw real estate maps, essentially. And so unlike most other kinds of maps, especially from this period of time, what we're really getting is a lot of information that is real estate based. And so we see this became a way for me to understand what the community looked like before everybody disappeared. By the time I photographed that cemetery, there was no longer a Black community in Port Republic anymore. And so this was a wonderful discovery to be able to find this little picture, in a sense, of what the community had looked like. This project, called Small Towns, Black Lives, consists of photographs with the use of narrative fragments and various archival materials. The images are presented as windows onto the public and private lives, combined with text They weave a visual representation of the present accompanied by collective memories from the communities. Small Towns Black Lives is also a multimedia web-based presentation that includes photography, text, archival documents, video, audio, and QuickTime VR. We don't, we don't have the time to see all of that, but the original website, which is now decades old, has been preserved online, and it's simply blacktowns.org, and you can sort of see what I was working on in the late 90s and early 2000s. The photographs began as a modest attempt to depict daily events and activities. Shortly after the beginning of the project, I became aware of a cemetery not far from the college where I teach, now university. 4 of the 5 remaining headstones are marked as veterans of the Civil War and the United States colored troops. Information about the origins of the cemetery was difficult to find since there was no longer a black community at that site. My encounter with this neglected cemetery led to more formal research and genealogy as I attempted to reconstruct the story of the African American settlement that was once located at the far edge of Port Republic. And in particular, that's an important piece for me to mention, because research then gradually becomes a central component of my work. And so almost after this project certainly led to research, but it started with just a instinctual desire to photograph and to see whether or not these communities would lead me to something interesting in terms of work, something interesting in terms of a narrative. And in fact, when I started this project, I had no concept that I would actually incorporate this writing with that. I'll stop for 1 second in this photograph, because this photograph, actually separated from the text in the current context, has been traveling around the United States in Deb Willis's exhibition called Posing Beauty for I don't know how many years. I've actually forgotten how long it's been since I last saw the print that I lent to the exhibition, but I do believe it'll be opening in 2021 and at the State Museum in Trenton. It just sort of has been going all around the country. And it ties to in particular, Mrs. Salters was, at this point when I met her, she was a widow. She lived on her own, and she really was the center of her household and world. And even before her husband had passed, she really represented a very strong figure within their marriage, their lives, the children's lives, etc. With that, I became interested, along with everything else that I was doing. I noticed as I went around the degree to which formerly segregated schools were still present in the landscape, still very much a part of these communities throughout southern New Jersey. And I even came across this photograph, which interestingly belied the segregation, which was of children in the Port Republic School. And what was remarkable is these are the children from the community that I was looking at, and that included the map and the cemetery. And the reason it's remarkable is not the way in which segregation played out throughout New Jersey and throughout the United States, is that it also played within a context of viability and convenience. And so in this particular case, there weren't enough black students for this school to even create a separate black class, as some schools did. For instance, in Swedesboro, initially, before they had a separate school, they just had black students in the classrooms in the basement, separate from the white students in the upper levels of the school. And so that kind of variety of iterations of segregation is remarkable. But here was a community that just simply couldn't, sustain that kind of support for segregation. That led me to, as I traveled around the country, to a project called Schools for the Colored. And this school and this site really was what crystallized the idea for me. Brooklyn, Illinois which has now been deincorporated and is part of East St. Louis, um, is the only place that I've ever come across, which is a black town, primarily a black town, that had within its boundaries a small white community. And even though they had a large a black school system and the school board was controlled by African Americans, the social contract of the time required them to create a separate school for a handful of white students within their district and hire a white teacher for those students. So from this moment forward, I was really interested in what remained of the black schools that were in the American landscape, and then gradually the project crystallized to be the schools that are located in the north, at the southern part of the northern states, between the Atlantic Ocean and the Mississippi River. So these schools are located in New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Ohio, Indiana, and Illinois. This is actually a reconstructed building. The only original part is the brick on the bottom. The rest of the school had collapsed, but the community wanted to restore the school in terms of the way it originally had been. And in fact, inside it looks like a 1940s, 1950s schoolhouse in the interior. This is an active school. Not too many are still active as schools. This is really a pretty famous one in Indianapolis, a huge, large school. A lot of them are abandoned buildings. A lot of the buildings have been repurposed. And this is the Marshalltown School, which you saw as part of the material that was used for promotion. And there's one piece that I wanted to just read a little bit, which was also part of the inspiration in this, and it was tied to W.E.B. Du Bois. And you notice how the school buildings are separated from the landscape, kind of in a way that's somewhat opposite the figures in Glynnis's work in the landscape. And I was struck by this notion. This is what really shaped it. Originally, I wasn't doing this, but what really shaped it for me was W.E.B. Du Bois. In The Souls of Black Folk, he described an early school experience. I was different from the others, or like, mayhap, in heart and life and longing, but shut out from their world by a vast veil. And so eventually the veil became a great metaphor, and this was also an opportunity for me to move away from some of the reliance upon text. It wasn't that I was unhappy with the text work that I had done, but I had created so many works and done such a large project with schools for with Small Towns Black Lives that I was interested in moving away from the reliance on text to make images that were purely visual representations. I mentioned early on that experience in finding the map that gave me a picture of what the Port Republic community looked like. And I held on to, and there were a number of places in Small Towns Black Lives where I used archival material. And so I held on to this idea that the archive was also a place that was of great interest to me. So I've moved to really sort of focus on the landscape, and then I moved to look at the archive. This is at the Alexander Library. It's a fragment of a Confederate shell from Fort Sumter, a slave collar, also up in the Rutgers collection, and a range of different collections from around the country. Nebraska State Historical Society, and some of these are really quotidian, everyday kinds of objects. This is a lunch pail in Eatonville, and that was a wonderful project that I got involved with for the Zora Neale Hurston anniversary of Their Eyes Were Watching God, the drum from a local band, and I even discovered a little bit of music history when I was in Omaha, the degree to which so many big bands had that Omaha and that area was kind of the spring training for major big bands that were touring the country throughout the whole big band era. And so those well-known band leaders that we know of like Duke Ellington or Tommy Dorsey or any of those people. They would tap their talent from these Midwestern bands that were playing in this area. So these bands were really well known in the Midwest area and were on the circuit. And then the sort of stellar players from these bands would wind up getting moved up, to the big leagues with the major players. Again, a watch from down in Eatonville, a doorknob, and I just love these vernacular things. And I was really moved to have the opportunity to photograph some objects in the collection at the Harriet Tubman House in Auburn, New York, one of a number of locations, basically the final living location for Harriet Tubman at the end of her life. She, in fact, established a kind of senior citizens home there as well. A range of different objects had been excavated from her home site by the folks at Syracuse University. Buttons, a button from the March on Washington, and I came across a number of items that just were, kind of remarkable as I went from place to place and looked at different types of objects in different collections. And I have to say, I was always remarkably impressed and touched by the degree to which the librarians and the curators of all these different collections were really open to allowing me to handle the objects and to work with different kinds of objects that had been brought into their collection. So it was just a wonderful opportunity with regard to that. A fragment that somebody had held of a wedding dress held onto a piece of fabric. This was part of this image, and a number of others, many others, were part of an opportunity I had to photograph the objects in the collection at the National Museum of African American History and Culture just before the opening. Smithsonian Magazine ran a special issue of images of objects from the collection, and so they asked me to make those images, and then they paired those images with text from various people, a whole range of different people. And of course, I was particularly moved by the fact that among that list of people was John Lewis, who, passed away recently. And so I was really, honored that of all of the different people that wrote responses to the images, but of course, John Lewis was particularly important. And what it also opened up for me, maybe a little bit more than many of the other collections, was access to more contemporary objects. And in this particular case, a door from Hurricane Katrina. And these are all things that the Smithsonian has collected. And this is a mirrored casket that was used during the demonstrations in Ferguson, Missouri, after the killing of Michael Brown. And so it was, in and of itself, it's kind of a community-based art piece that was carried around during the protest so that it would reflect back the images of the people around as a kind of statement about the death of justice. But at the same time, it just gradually acquired all of these different qualities that just made it remarkable. And of course, it was my good fortune that the Smithsonian was able to collect it. And this image in particular has been borrowed from me, and I have lent it quite generously for free to people who have been writing articles, contemporary articles about this event, because the mirrored casket is so important. And a tape recorder from Malcolm X. And I photographed this in DC, but what's remarkable is that I also, had a great opportunity to photograph some of Malcolm X material in Omaha, because in fact, Omaha is where Malcolm X is originally from. And so I like some of the interconnections, Omaha being an early site for some of my work on the manifest, and James Baldwin, inkwell, an ambrotype of Frederick Douglass, a flute from flute player who was known as Blind Tom, who was sort of taken around the country as a kind of curiosity, and we have a whole history of especially 19th century and uses of African Americans as oddities and curiosities, being taken around everyone from Sarge Bartman as in Europe, and all kinds of situations that that included that. And Blind Tom was able to had the ability to hear a piece of music, no matter how complex it was, one time and play it back perfectly right away. And so he would play these long classical passages on the flute, and he had a manager who would just sort of take him from place to place and make a bunch of money off of him. But evidently, he had a remarkable talent. And again, touching back on the issue of segregation and colored schools is the experiments done by Kenneth and Mamie Clark, and the partnership again between the two of them, both sociologists, psychologists, to make the case for the Supreme Court case for Brown, and they had been working on this for a number of years, the degree to which even black children gradually, because of internalized racism, would show preferences for the white doll, and that damage that the internalized racism would cause. It's a very powerful set of ideas that is still with us today, unfortunately, in many ways. One of the first books, and this is actually part of the first set of photographs that I made in this project at all. It's the first book owned by Frederick Douglass after he became free of slavery, and it's held in the library at the University of Rochester in their rare books and rare collection, obviously, but nevertheless, it's just, this is what started me, which was the idea that somebody would just hand me this book for me to photograph was just powerful. This is a sketchbook of Zora Neale Hurston's. I became fascinated with the history of Little Black Sambo. This is a French publication, although it was published in New York. A journal from the Black Doctor in Buffalo. This is from Salem, and this is the Clarkson abolition of the slave trade. And what you would know is what you see peeking out of this if you don't recognize it by the title. And this is the infamous illustration of Africans packed into the hull of a ship. Kind of coming down. It's been used by so many artists, and it's been transformed into in so many ways. But in its original form, it was a tipped-in illustration in this Clarkson abolition of the slave trade, published in England. And I just am drawn to many, many of these images. This is a photograph of the aftermath of the lynching of Will Brown in 1919 in Omaha, Nebraska. A lock of Frederick Douglass's hair in Rochester, New York, and a lock of Frederick Douglass's hair in Lincoln, Nebraska. And other Douglass family members, Rosetta Douglass, Connie Vanderzee, a relative of the photographer James Vanderzee, and a whole way Frederick Douglass Jr., a local newspaper in Omaha, the Afro-American Sentinel. Atlantic City, Iowa. A letter somebody wrote to Zora Neale Hurston in the collection at the University of Florida, and it's addressed to Goddess Neale Hurston. I love the address there. Slave shackles in the Smithsonian collection. Confederate flag and Cape May collection. This was the piece that John Lewis wrote his response to, which is the waiting room sign from the segregated bus station. A shard of the stained glass window from the 16th Street Baptist Church, where the bombing took place that killed the four little girls. And just a remarkable documentary. The FBI files of Malcolm X. A woman's clanhood from New Jersey chapter. German postcards. The Cotton Club. Another item from the Cotton Club. And a decorative coin bank. And the Manifest Project is bringing together a whole range of different pieces, both of Black agency and Black pain, all woven together. The way in which many different kinds of painful and remarkable events took place. And I know I've reached the end of Manifest, but I do want to just reflect back. And the wonderful scholar Lee Rayford at Berkeley kindly wrote a introduction to a book published of my work about Manifest, in which she says, in Manifest, Wendel makes historical objects intimate and singular. These objects, an oxidized spoon, an open diary, a slave bill of sale, and perhaps above all a lock of Frederick Douglass, are embodied, had once touched flesh, had been manipulated by human hands, and lived in the world before they were packed up into the archive. And I thought we had had a conversation very much like the one that Glynnis and I are hopefully going to have in just a minute at the the Afro-American Diaspora Museum in San Francisco in relationship to an exhibition, and then that led to her essay. And then the final project, and this picture was made in Omaha, and it was while I was working on those objects, and I mentioned to you already the lynching of Will Brown, and this is the intersection where the famous photograph is made of Will Brown's burned body surrounded by all the smiling faces of the men who had lynched him and brought him, and then dragged his body through the streets and then set it on fire. What's remarkable to get to him, and this is where I start to combine these newspaper stories, that they attempted to hang the white mayor of Omaha because he wasn't willing to turn over his prisoner. He was probably going to ultimately hang Will Brown after he had been tried, but he didn't want to turn his prisoner over to a mob, and so they started to hang him, and then the police rescued the mayor. And all of these scenes are scenes from around the country where battles were taking place all over the United States in 1919. It was a period of time known as Red Summer, and it had sort of a dual meaning, although primarily James Weldon Johnson, who named it Red Summer, was referring to the violence, but also part of that violence was an anxiety on the part of many Americans that there were communist and Bolshevik influences taking place in the Black community in the United States, and some of that was believed because of all the Black soldiers that had returned from World War I back to the United States. I just noticed that there is a new movie that's been made about the event that took place at this site in Houston, in different places, Knoxville, Tennessee, and next month I'm going to be having a conversation with Arlene Kaiser, who's done some wonderful research about Red Summer, and the painter Beaufort Smith, and the fact that he was a teenager at the moment of this riot, and then his trajectory to becoming a mentor for James Baldwin. And so I'll just move kind of quickly. This is And they're not all 1919. This is 1923, Rosewood, Ohio, Ohio, Gary, Indiana, Chicago, one of the worst of the attacks, and of course Tulsa, which we've seen a tremendous amount about recently. And so this just, and East St. Louis, which was 1917, and this was probably a couple hundred people were killed by the mobs. New scholarship, like as the scholarship that's happening in Tulsa right now to try and determine the real death toll has happened in a number of these different sites. And I've reached the end of my pictures.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
That was wonderful. So should we join into our questions for one another now?
Sure. So I guess first of all, before Glynnis and I have questions for each other, but I see a bunch of questions in the list, so maybe we'll give some folks that are here listening to us an opportunity.
And Sarah's going to help you out with those as well.
Right.
And if you'd like to stop sharing your screen, then we can see both of you.
Thank you for reminding me.
Okay. I have a question for Glynnis first.
Okay.
Glynnis, what is your process? Do you start with an idea and then find your imagery, or are you inspired by the images that you take and then create your artwork?
I typically am inspired by a feeling, usually. And I don't start off typically with a certain vision of what my end result will be, although sometimes that does come into play. But oftentimes it's an exploration for me as I get involved in my process. I start to get into the imagery and get into using color, especially now working with color. And it's really just I won't go so far as to say it's an intuitive process, but I would say that it has intuitive aspects in my approach to how I engage with my imagery. But I am very exploratory and I like to discover as I go along while I start to construct meaning as I get closer to the end of my works. And I get to see an overall picture come into play as I assemble multiple pieces as I start to work. So.
Okay. And another question for you, Glynnis.
Okay.
Was the choice to have your models in plain clothes intentional or something that developed naturally?
It is intentional. I actually had someone comment about the assumption piece, asking about why it wasn't something more dramatic or kind of theatrical as far as the attire. But I want to show something of everyday people, kind of collide that otherworldly experience that you see in some of the later works with just everyday, who we are in our quotidian lives. And then even with elements of love, this was about my everyday life that I was having in relationship with someone. So I wasn't interested in having something super theatrical. I wanted to have it look nice, but be something that was more casual in terms of the attire.
Okay. And then another question, I made a note of when we got this one because it seems pretty specific. How large are these prints? And this was around the Ascending Beauty series.
Ascending Beauty there are 16 by 16 inches.
Okay.
And framed, they're about 20 by 20 inches.
And
the other works are different sizes.
Okay. A question for both of you. Would either of you like to share any advice for other artists on how to stand out and become established? This one's kind of hard. Sorry, guys.
Wendel? Do you want to start off?
Well, if I'm gonna dive in on that, I think that it's important to answer that by starting out and saying that there's not one way, and what I have seen is that there are just a tremendous number of ways in which individuals, various types of individuals, build a life, and that's really what I would like to frame it as: build a life of creative activity, a life in the arts, a life related to making and sharing these kinds of images, and then determining through that process whether or not that will be a full-time consuming, absolutely, taking over every aspect of your life, that kind of then with the potential of generating all the income necessary for that kind of sustaining that kind of practice, or will it be a practice that you work at sort of gradually and slowly over time, in the way that somebody might, I always think of, a couple of different writers. One I won't mention because he's gotten in trouble because of his behavior at various times, but I do know that his very popular first novel took him about 11 years to write, and then his second novel took him another 10 years to write. And so I always turn to those kinds of examples because it is an example of the fact that in many cases, people that we recognize as having accomplishments have invested a lot of time and done it through different kinds of activity. So I think that as long as an artist, the amount of time you get to dedicate to art making is satisfying to you and not frustrating, then then you're successful. Then
Yeah.
that's successful.
Yes. I'm so glad you answered first, Wendell. You have such a long career and such a reputation. I mean, you're a great person to answer that question. But I agree. I absolutely agree with what you said. I think that if you are doing what you love to do, because it's hard to really be successful in the art field if you don't love what you're doing. You have to have a true passion for this. And just as you said, there's so many routes and pathways to finding what will give you your bliss in what you're doing. And I, do think that being an educator is a wonderful route to supporting yourself as an artist, and to even feed yourself and your creativity while you're doing your work. So that's something I like to see happen, is there become more diversity in the art teaching field, so that more people know that that's an opportunity and a possibility. If you're a person that likes to do art, or you enjoy art in some way, to know that you could potentially be an art teacher, maybe K-12 art teacher. That's a wonderful opportunity that we have here in New Jersey, that there are opportunities to be an elementary art teacher, and that's not the case. That wasn't the case when I was coming along in Los Angeles. You could only be an art teacher for middle school or high school.
Mm-hmm.
So I think education is a wonderful way to stay involved and be involved with lots of different people as an artist and as a creator.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Absolutely.
You both answered that so well. Let's see. Wendell,
Yes.
why did you choose to have some of your items partly blurred? Lord.
Right. Oh, so absolutely. In the Manifest Project, right. So, one of the things that is important to me in that project was the notion that the photographs were reflecting an experience that I was having, and that experience was very much one that was like time travel, and I was moving back through these layers of history, these layers of obfuscation, to the degree to which many of these narratives have been erased and made invisible in the contemporary world. And so some of them are, certainly important and significant in various ways, but others, especially the stories and the narratives of ordinary people's lives, are just really very powerful in that way. I mean, even though he was very well known for a period of time until I encountered Blind Tom and his flute. I did not know that story. That was the first I had heard that story. And so that kind of experience is what has driven me. But I want to make photographs that reflect the fact that I'm, sort of gradually seeing these things come into focus. And so, and I also don't think it's essential to know everything about the subject. I'm not. I'm a person that is often drawn towards photographs that have ambiguity, or just artwork in general that leaves a certain degree of ambiguity and uncertainty about what's to be thought, what's to be done about what you're experiencing, and so that in and of itself is a compelling element. And I say that in spite of the fact that earlier I was like writing these long stories telling you, look, this is exactly what's happening here. So maybe it was partly an antidote to telling too much of what was going on, or so much. I won't say too much, but so much of what was going on. So I think maybe that was also um, a reason.
I remember when you came back from that trip and you were telling me about it, and you were like, I just took all these photos, and I was
And it's always great
in
to
the
have,
archives.
you're right. It's always great to have an excuse to show up in these places and have
That was so fun.
hair in your hand. That's yeah.
It was so fun to hear about it one-on-one, and then you had your big talk at Stockton, or maybe two. I feel like you had two, and that I could hear it again in a
Right.
different perspective. It was so fun. Let's see. Another question for you, Wendell. As research seems to be a large part of your process, how do you find yourself beginning this gathering of stories?
Right. So it's almost always, and hopefully I tried to touch on this, the degree to which they emerge from previous stories. So as I was working on Small Towns, Black Lives, I was noticing these schools, and I was thinking like, wow, this is kind of interesting. All of these segregated schools, and I've done workshops, since I worked on the Schools for the Colored project for teachers in New Jersey. And, I've encountered many teachers that, come to the workshop. I used to do Clem Price's African American Scholarship Summer Teacher Institute for the Humanities. And many of the teachers would say, I had no idea there was a segregated school in New Jersey. I thought, and this is what really pushed me to stay in the North, is that we always think of it as something in the South. And then as I worked on the schools, I then also thought about the archival material that I was encountering as I did that research. And, one thing just often leads to another. And as I said, I was in Omaha making photographs for Manifest when I came across the story of Will Brown's lynching in 1919. And I really couldn't let that go because not only was it horrific, but it also appears in Henry Fonda's biography, the American actor Henry Fonda's biography, because his father had a printing press across the street from City Hall, and as a teenager, he witnessed the lynching. He and his father were so afraid of the crowd, they escaped out of the back. And the way he tells it in his autobiography is that as his father was driving away, it was just like tears because he had never seen somebody killed in that way. And it was this young man, and it was somebody who was not that far from him in age. He was somebody who was young, who was just dangling from the lamppost. And so those kinds of things made that story seem so real, and I had to do more with 1919.
Mm.
Okay. I have a question for Glynnis now.
Okay.
What is the most underlying aspect of the energy behind the Beheld Beings series that you identify with? It is truly an intriguing series.
Oh, thank you so much. I did those pieces over a period of time, so the feeling behind each work, and there's more in the series as well, is definitely very intense feelings, very kind of, highly wrought feelings for me. Sometimes it's sadness, sometimes it's frustration, sometimes it's joy, sometimes it's discovery and fascination with this process I'm in. One of the pieces, as I was drawing it, I just kept feeling so drawn and attracted to trying to discover who this person was that I was drawing, who was becoming revealed to me in the process. And so it's, you know, in the process of drawing like that, it's like very passionate but peaceful at the same time, because it's kind of soothes the emotions as well. So
Okay, thank you. Let's see, another question. I think this is for both of you. How do you know when a piece is finished? Is it when you feel you have nothing else to add, or is it more of a visual decision?
that's a good question. I have some pieces that I'm probably like still wanting to do something to after years later. Actually, I have one painting that I created. I started when I'm back 20 years ago, and I've still come back to this painting, still working on resolving this painting. But that's not typical, of course. But um, it typically it depends upon the demands of completing a series, you know. So as I'm completing a body of work along a certain theme, I'm wanting to tie things together a certain way. And because I want to make them a part of a group and have them be cohesive, that kind of helps bring closure to when certain pieces are completed and when a certain series might be completed as well. But there are certain series too that I tend to want to go back to and add more pieces to, because my heart still is in it and still wants to explore that terrain.
Yeah, I have to agree. I think I have the same experience, which is um, maybe plays out in a little bit differently for me, but in many ways the same way. And often I have, you know, no idea when I'm done unless, you know, I just lose interest in it. I move on to something else, or some other shiny object, you know, catches my attention. But it can be difficult, and sometimes it's very um, symmetrical. So with Schools for the Colored, I wound up getting to a point where I had 10 buildings in each of the 5 states, and I felt like, okay, well, that's a nice round number, and I don't, you know, and with many things, I don't feel like I have to do everything. I'm not, with all the research and the degree to which history is an element in my work, I don't feel that I have any of the responsibilities that a historian might have to be absolutely thorough. I'm looking at just sort of extracting material that I can respond to as an artist. But I do also have the same experience as Glynnis, which is I have gone back to pieces and changed my mind. And the original images for Schools for the Colored actually looked like Small Towns, Black Lives. They were the building and then a text panel next to it, sort of describing those images. And then I gradually abandoned that and redid them and changed them and became the way they appear now.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, I have another question for both of you. Could you could you both talk a bit more about your relationship between social justice and art in your work in an artistic process?
Um,
Should I start or?
sure. Yeah.
Okay. Well, for me, I'm looking forward to getting more and deepening my commitment to social justice through my doctoral program that I'm going to be beginning in January at Penn State. I'm going to be starting art education and women's gender and sexuality studies. And I'm really interested in uplifting the lives of Black women and girls, Black girls. And I'm looking forward to doing research that's going to be able to make some things happen in terms of my research, to broaden my artwork, as well as things I can do in concrete ways to change the lives of Black girls and women in art education in schools. And for now, I feel like my work very much is on a level of the emotional and soul level of adding to the narratives and stories that are out there that broaden what we know about Black lives, about Black women's lives, about nature. So for me, my social justice activity operates on those levels. And like I said, I'm looking forward to deepening it as I go into my doctoral program.
In particular, I'm happy that question came out because um, I have been, I was really moved at, and I've heard Glynnis talk about her work, and we sat on a panel once before when she had an exhibition at the Noise Museum, and so I have familiarity, but I think this is true for all of us as artists. When you get a chance to listen again, you hear new things, you hear it in a slightly different way, and I really was, you know, powerfully moved by a number of the elements that came out in the discussion of women's bodies in relationship to the land, to the landscape, and all of those elements. And in fact, I, you
Okay.
know, have a couple of my own questions, but we'll see if we get to those. But answering this question, you know, I have, and this is where my early experience serving on a panel when I was very um, much an emerging artist, a little baby artist, um, was that it felt it's so important that we have this multitude of voices telling a range of different stories, and I don't feel like I have a particular task ahead of me, but I have, for whatever reason, found a particular voice in thinking about kind of the ghosts of the past and the way the ghosts that haunt our world, our landscape, are continually, you know, having an impact on what's happening as we go from day to day and our experience. And I hope that makes a contribution, even though many times I'm not necessarily photographing the current moment. I'm hopefully photographing something that informs our experience about the current moment. Right? So um, I don't in any way um, uh, know whether or not the work that I've been doing makes a difference, but I am always interested in adding to the conversation. So I want to make a contribution to the conversation, make a contribution to the possibility that someone might see and understand black life in a different way than they had ever seen it before or ever experienced it before, and possibly recognize that complexity that I talked about with Manifest in particular, but it's also present in all of the projects, which is the degree to which it represents simultaneously Black agency, Black uh, enterprise, Black self um, preservation, and self an accomplishment, but yet at the same time the pain imposed on the Black world, particularly in this country, and how and what that impact is like, and what that impact on the community has been like.
Absolutely. Beautiful.
Okay, I'll do one last quick question before you guys can ask each other the questions that you have. Quick one. What are your favorite bodies of work that you've created?
Yikes.
Yeah,
Oh,
sorry. Keep a couple. There you go.
oh boy. So you have to pick your firstborn over your lastborn.
Right.
Yeah.
For me, as far I'm in the midst of creating some new bodies of work right now, and I have to say the interesting thing that happens is how, like Wendell says, things become birthed out of past exploration, past series, developed new ideas. But I will say that as I was putting together my slideshow, the cosmic exploration of I forget the name that I titled it, but there are a series of works that I really want to go back to it and explore more and create more, because my model Melissa is just such an interesting alter ego for me, and I use her to represent myself in a lot of my work, and it's a way people say that we look alike, and so it's like a way for me to reflect upon myself and to explore whole new worlds that I can create and imagine through using this model that's so emotive and evocative. So I have source material from different series that sometimes I want to dip into and create new things from. So um, from the earth to the sky is the favorite series, Elements of Love, the Beheld Beings, Ascending Beauty. Those are all some of my most favorite series I've created. And I also paint, and I love painting nature. I have landscapes that I painted of fallen trees. So I hope that I can share more of my painting work moving forward as well. I've shared it at places like Riverfront Renaissance in the past, and some other spaces locally, but I'm looking forward to doing more mixed media work and more paintings on paper. So
I would say for me, the answer to that is that is a little bit complicated. I have great fondness for Small Towns, Black Lives because it was a really immersive experience. I worked on it for a very long period of time, 12 years or more, produced a lot of work, produced a wonderful catalog with essays by people that I respect tremendously. So that that experience is just so rich in terms of the effort that I put into something and the results that came out of it. Excuse me. But right now, I'm I find that and I really very excited about many of my all of the projects, but right now I'm particularly interested in Manifest because it just keeps opening up more and more and more. So I feel like it has the potential to be one of the largest projects in the end.
I love that. I love that you have the work from the museum in DC as well. That, like you were saying, brings it into the contemporary era.
Right.
More images from the contemporary era, so that fully, expands the field even more.
Exactly.
For what
Exactly.
you can do, which is really wonderful.
Yeah, thank you. And interestingly, I didn't get to include them, but I've been working with the Mutter Mutter Museum in Philadelphia, the College of Physicians, and they have remarkable things in the collection that speak to the question of race within the medical profession, especially in the 19th century and earlier. And of course, right now, one of our biggest concerns is the degree to which this pandemic has exposed a disparity between different ethnicities in this country in terms of the impact, in terms of the possible, um, healthcare in general that takes place within each community. And so it's just a remarkable um, opportunity to begin. Also, it opened up a new possibility to think about the role of medicine and race within the United States as well. So they're just. I feel like again, each door opens another door, and so possibly Manifest will go on for a while. It's hard to know where that will end.
If you two have any other questions for each other, then it's probably a good time now.
Okay.
Okay. Can I start with?
Go into the next
You can
part.
start.
One question. I have several questions. I know we don't have time, but one I really am really curious about is your philosophy on digital manipulations and interventions in your images.
Right. So, and I have to add to this that for a period of time before I began working on Small Towns, Black Lives, I also was, very involved in experimental imagery and in the landscape, and in fact, before that, even before the digital intervention, I was experimenting with camera movement and a range of different things. So I've never had a particularly um, requisite notion of what the photographic image should be like. And so in spite of the fact that many of my photographs are, I guess if you would describe it, kind of formal as images and straightforward in some ways, but I am always interested in and compelled by the idea that I could use a digital tool as an intervention with analog and bringing those two together, and maybe not quite as well, certainly not as effectively as you bring other plastic processes like drawing and painting into the photographic medium. I have just continually, experimented with um, processes that play on the optics and the use of the lens in one way or another, and then play within that realm. But I am, always in awe of the way in which you bring yet other media together, and I think that's a remarkable way of having the photograph have a conversation with a broader range of experiences, and I think it's a wonderful way of opening up the photograph to a broader range of
Thank you so much.
experience. Yeah.
I always really admired Schools for the Colored in the way that you use the digital interventions, the kind of the collaging elements, very
Right.
conceptually. So it's like how you mentioned that you don't have
Mm.
the text boxes accompanying the works, but the way that you intervene in these shapes and these forms that you isolate
Right.
and create silhouettes and some that are veilings, it's really amazing.
Thank you.
Amazing way. It's very like kind of somewhat almost austere, but also very nuanced in the way that you use the different degrees of transparency to the veils and whatnot. Really nice.
And some of that goes to what I was saying about the optics, and many of the effects are things that happen naturally as the veil gets laid over top of different types of images, different interactions take place, and sometimes the background almost disappears, sometimes it's very present. But I did find for a long period of time as I was working on those that it was a quite meditative process as I spent time, one, carefully deciding, how, as I selected the building and isolated it. But what was most interesting was making the decision what to select and what not to select. Because
Mhm.
in many cases, things come in and get intersected and a range of different things. So that was for me a really rewarding part of doing that work.
Absolutely. And that's what makes it so interesting too, is wondering, well, why did he decide to leave the light post here and the tree
Right,
here? It's like it's a very interesting question. You question those images.
right.
There's so many of them in a series. And so, you start to have the relationships between them, which makes for an interesting story by itself.
Absolutely. So, that idea of the landscape brings me to the thing that I've actually got a couple of them, here, but I wondered specifically, this may be a good connection, which is the degree to which you're using the landscape and its relationship to bodies. I'm wondering the degree to which the sort of past events that took place in those landscapes, how do those have an impact on you? I mean, what are those kinds of narratives about what those places were like? I think especially in the West, I mean, obviously it's fraught with lots of, complicated, I mean, well, all across our country, but, in a more contemporary sense, the Western landscape is just layered with complicated, issues about uh, race and land use and in the environment and so many different things.
Right, right. Yeah, with urban sites, just documenting South LA, and knowing how different it is now. Even the neighborhood where I grew up is completely different from how it is back when I was living there 10 years ago.
Right.
Completely different. SpaceX is right within like walking
You
distance from
can go
my
to the moon. You can go to the
right
moon
now.
now. Right.
It's like really close. But yeah, I mean, you know, gentrification, all that has like played such an incredible impact in Los Angeles. And so, you know, what I was documenting and what I was photographing in that series back then, not only are these businesses different, I'm sure many times over these years, but it's also the terrain of the demographics and the landscape. You know,
Right.
I'm sure that the population, proportions of the population are different now. Back then, more heavily Latino than Black.
Right.
And being Black in Los Angeles is, you know, you're a very kind of a small minority. So
Mm-hmm.
when I moved here and went to places like Philadelphia and saw such a much larger Black presence, it was, you know, it was a welcome shock because
Right.
I hadn't experienced that before, you
Right.
know, growing up and living in LA all my life.
Absolutely.
So yeah, I think that I was sort of searching for those lines, those dividing lines. Like, you know, there's divisions, you know, there's places that maybe people are not welcome, right?
Mm-hmm.
Black or Latino, but trying to find that through the surface of these buildings, kind of like how Kathy Opie photographed those the facades of these buildings
Mm-hmm.
and tried to capture those kind of enclaves that were very exclusive, you know, in her photography. But she captures the city as well, you know, the freeways and things like that.
Mm-hmm.
So that was kind of like my you know, my environment at the time when I was in grad school, because Kathy Opie actually had been at UCI prior to me being a student there. But yeah, so trying to find those welcome places, those safe places, you know, because there's also the history of gangs, you know, in Los Angeles. And so there are parts where I would see gang graffiti on houses, you know, on residential houses. That was one of the first photographs I took before I started the whole project. So yeah, there's histories. There's my personal history of growing up and trying to discover my way in these places, as well as what came before me, you know.
Yeah, and I think we all experience to some degree this notion that place, even without people, has implications for ethnicity and race. So that you roll into a particular neighborhood, and even if there's nobody on the street, you begin thinking, well, this may or may not be right, but I think this is where I am. And
Right.
where I'm not, you know, and all of the implications that go with that, and our sense of, um, you know, safety, our sense of, as you referenced it, welcome. You know, is this a place where I'm going to be welcome? Is this a place where I will be safe? Is this a place where that is unsafe in some way? And all of those things play out in subtle ways in terms of just little clues around visual clues that for instance, in your project, as you go and look at these different buildings and facades, they tell you certain kinds of things about where you are, and they have implications about these places. Um, Unfortunately, some of those implications are, you know, part of the stereotypes that have been built into, you know, this country about the type of people that live in this place or that place. And so, you know, if a neighborhood, even if we just look at it from a class point of view, if a neighborhood looks poor, well, this is what is probably happening here in this poor neighborhood. And if a neighborhood is wealthy, you know, these are, you know, people that have succeeded, and so therefore they must be good people, that kind of thing, you know.
Yeah, yeah.
Um, and with that, I wanted to sort of tie this notion that you talked about, and this would maybe be a good place for it because, in particular, as we're talking about the landscape, you referenced the idea of women's bodies in relationship to the earth and that significance, and the significance of that relationship. But I wonder if these images are if these issues are also embedded in the relationship between Black bodies or women's bodies in particular, since we're maybe thinking a little bit about Breonna Taylor today, and the cultural landscape, the landscape of social environments, and so a little bit separate from the natural environment in that way. Although I have to say I've been very interested in the number of TV commercials that I've seen lately that show Black folks in like the forest and the woods and things like that, because I never saw those
Kind of a new
before.
thing, right?
It's a new thing, right?
So, can you tell me more? You're asking about any particular body of work in
Not
relation?
one particular body, but as you go, sort of as I think about your work, and it goes back and forth between these spaces, which I'll, identify as cultural, social places, places where humans have made a mark in some way. They're built up, they're developed, or something
Right,
of that
right.
nature. And then your conscious effort, it seems, to place figures in the natural landscape, the you know, sort of touched by human development kind of landscape, and how those two things are impacting each other. And you talked a bit about that relationship to the natural environment, and I wondered, what the implications are a little bit more in the cultural environment, because again, as I said, I'm thinking about Breonna Taylor. She lived in an apartment and in a city, and these are the kinds of things that happen, um, in these environments.
Well, I think probably the most recent series that I've done that involves the built environment and the urban presence with the graffiti and all that is From the Earth to the Skies.
Hmm.
And but in that you don't necessarily see um, a human presence. There's the
Hmm.
paintings, the figures that are
Right,
painted in there.
right,
Um, so it's like I think there's kind of a relationship to place that's really important for me, and I think that's where it comes into play.
hmm,
There's what is the social environment that defines and shapes us, and where's that place that we might go for a refuge or for kind of a counterbalance to the effects of society that might delete us, delete
hmm,
aspects of our well-being, So I find that I probably get more attracted to nature and natural environments more and more because of the way that it replenishes me, even just in working with that imagery.
right.
So, um, so as far as bodies of work that I'm interested in having be seen and exhibited and be exhibited on display and things like that. It's not as much work that's situated in the city and urban environments these days,
Hmm.
but I think it's an interesting trajectory that's taken place for me over the years in my search for those peaceful places, those places to emerge from and to form identity. So, Paper Thin Boundaries, they
Right.
were all in constructed natural environments. They were adjacent, these places were adjacent to the city or adjacent to the town. I could walk,
Mm.
walk by businesses in Austria and get to this park that
Right.
you can find this refuge. So I think it's kind of interesting to think about those places that collide, where those two things collide, that urban or that built environment and the natural space, even though I tend to want to withdraw into the natural
Right.
more and more.
Right. More and more. Right. Absolutely. Well, I think those were my. Well, I did have one sort of, just you as you had started to work on the pieces that were more cinematic, like film frames. Which project? I
Mhm.
get the which project title is
That's
that?
that shadow my likeness.
That Shadow My Likeness. Do you have some film references that are important to you, because this is just something that for me I am thinking about and looking at all the time, and annoying my students with references to films that they've never heard of.
Mm.
Um,
I would have to say I think one of my all-time favorites in the past few years has to be Moonlight.
mm,
I
right.
seen Moonlight so many times.
Right.
And not just for my teaching my class, but
Right.
like when it came out, I went to the theater twice and
Right.
sat in there and watched that movie. I love that movie so much, you know, and its connection to the water, to the landscape, to identity, that feeling of emotion and being an outsider, you know, like that movie really moved me a lot. Um,
Yeah, it was interesting. I had a conversation with a friend and it was a little ways after coming out of seeing the film, and it was the same, and it's infamous now, the Oscar debacle that took place.
right.
But so I had seen both films. I had seen, both of these films, and in the conversation, I said, well, I think obviously they're going to pick, the Hollywood, the sort of self-referential Hollywood film, but it I just had to get out the idea that I felt that Moonlight was just the best movie that I had seen that year, and
Yeah.
I just felt in advance I felt like, well, I just didn't have much hope, I guess, for it winning, an Oscar. And when it ultimately did, I was just, surprised, pleasantly surprised. But I just knew that unlike many other years when I've seen different films and I sort of will vacillate over the strengths of this one, the weaknesses of that one, it felt just as though it was perfect, and I couldn't imagine any part of it being done differently. So it was just a
Yeah,
real,
just a beautiful, beautiful film.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah. And I have to admit, I'm more of a book person. I love to
Mhm.
read. I'm not really a person that watches a lot of movies,
Okay.
but Moonlight is it's just like, man, it,
Right. Right.
it was the one. It was the film for me. I loved it.
Yeah. Yeah. No, yeah, sitting through it, it was just a remarkable
And
way.
beautifully shot. Oh my
Yeah.
God, the cinematography was just amazing.
Right. And that's what led, in a sense, to my question, was the degree to which that project of yours that, sort of thinks about that cinematic way of looking at things and seeing the
Right.
world, not just because of the frames, but also the framing within the individual images is, for me, one of the projects that really speaks to me because of my real passion for watching film, and of course now long form serial programming, so that there are all these sort of things that are basically TV shows but are kind of 10-hour movies basically
Right. Right.
spread out. um,
And it's a nonlinear frame sequence that I'm putting forward in those as well.
yeah,
So
absolutely.
what happens when you drop some of the frames out and you jump to something else? Almost I'm also interested in graphic novels too,
Right.
and I want to write a graphic novel about my life.
Yeah.
But so when you skip time and you jump uh, a time sequence by skipping frames, I'm interested in that series
Absolutely.
as well.
Yeah, absolutely. That's, and I noticed just recently that State of the Arts was uh, highlighting the work of, and I don't remember her name. She's teaching at Rider College, and she's the first Black woman to win the Eisner Award for a graphic novel at Comic Con.
Oh,
And so it really sort of stuck out, and I thought, oh, I've got to, you know, pay a little bit more attention to her work and find out a little bit more about that, because and just in the way that you're sort of talking about film and books, I'm sort of like the depth of my knowledge about graphic novels is not quite as extensive as it is with American film,
mm,
and and really mostly American film. Yeah.
right, right. Well, I'm still growing myself. I tend to be really interested in nonfiction, reading about theory and kind of metaphysics a lot in my
Right.
own personal reading.
Right.
But I took a graphic novel class at Fleischer a couple years ago, and it really, really grabbed me. And I felt like this would be a really great way for me to tell a story
Right.
and to express something, combining my love of writing and poetry with imagery. So
Wonderful.
something that I'm actually hoping to explore more when I go into my doctorate program.
Oh, great. Good. With congratulations, by the way.
Thank you so much. Yeah, thank you.
I'm looking, it looks like it's 8 o'clock. I don't know if our minders are still, there they are.
Yeah, popped up.
Popped up.
We are here.
Yeah, thank you both for joining us tonight.
Oh,
It was
thank
so lovely to have you.
You. Oh, it's been
you.
wonderful to be here. Thank you for having
Yeah. Any excuse to just sit, look at Glennis's work, look at, ask her questions, listen to other people ask her questions. I can't complain about that.
us. And hey, I'm a fan. I'm a fan, Wendell. So anytime I can have with you, it's great. So thank you so much for having us.
Wonderful.
And I wanted to thank you both as well. And I have just a few things to share to wrap things up. And for one of those are both of your websites. And so the websites are in the chat, and I wanted to make sure that everyone knew that they could contact me or Sarah for a copy of that chat. And this has been recorded, and it'll be on YouTube soon. And Sarah and my contact information is here, and it is on our website as well. And I have two more things. One is that the furnaces are currently burning in the glass studio. You can find fresh pumpkins daily that the artists are making at shop.wheatonarts.org. Certainly a fan favorite for WheatonArts.
It took one of ours out and put it on the sideboard.
Yeah.
Oh, nice.
And just a little bit more about Losang's presentation. His unique presentation and discussion will focus on the Wheel of Life mandala. You'll discover the many levels of interpretation and meanings behind this mandala, other types of mandalas, and the lessons that we can learn from each of them. And again, I want to thank both Glynnis and Wendel for being here, and all the participants. I have to say, there are just I want to share the chat with both of you, because there are just a wonderful amount of thanking you for the great presentation, for the wonderful conversation, the in-depth detail, and the inspiration, powerful images.
And if I can jump in just to say how much I appreciate, and I want to thank both Marcy and Sarah for everything that you guys have done, making this easy and just sort of like possible. And of course, WheatonArts, what a wonderful organization. And, you know, the colder it gets outside, you want to huddle around that flaming, you know, oven with glass, you know, to stay nice and warm. It's the place to go in the cold winter time.
Yes, yes. Well, thank you, and we'll sign off, and we will all be in touch one way or another.
Great.
Okay. Thank you so much.
Hi, everyone. Thank
Bye-bye.
you.
Good night.
Good night.